Margaret Foster had been a nurse for 23 years. At 52, she wore her blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun beneath her. Traditional white cap? The way nurses used to in the old days. She preferred the vintage blue uniform, too. It reminded her of why she'd entered this profession in the first place. To care, to comfort, to be present when people needed someone most. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows as Margaret made her rounds on the cardiac wing. Her sensible shoes barely made a sound on the polished floors. She'd walked these halls so many times she could navigate them in her sleep. But that Tuesday morning, everything changed. "Margaret!" Dr. Harrison called out, his voice heavy with something she couldn't quite place. Concern, perhaps? Or was it urgency? "Could you step into my office for a moment?" She followed him, her heart beginning to quicken. In all her years here, Dr. Harrison had never called her in like this. He closed the door gently and gestured to a chair. "There's a patient," he began slowly. "His name is Thomas Whitmore. Perhaps you've heard of him?" Margaret nodded slightly. Everyone had heard of Thomas Whitmore, the real estate developer, the philanthropist, the man whose buildings dotted the city skyline. "He's in end-stage heart failure," Dr. Harrison continued, his fingers steepled together on his desk. "He has weeks, maybe a month if we're fortunate, and he's made an unusual request." Margaret waited, her hands folded in her lap. "His family, well, they've shown their true colors, I'm afraid. The moment they learned he was dying, the lawsuits began. His brother, his nephew, even his business partner. Everyone fighting over his estate while he's still breathing." Dr. Harrison shook his head sadly. "Thomas wants to marry, quickly, to ensure his assets go to someone with a good heart rather than to people who only saw him as a bank account." Margaret felt her breath catch. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he's asked for you specifically. He's been observing you for the past 3 days since he was admitted. The way you treat every patient with dignity, how you held Mrs. Patterson's hand during her anxiety attack, how you stayed late to read to Mr. Chen when his family couldn't visit." The words hung in the air between them. "He's offering financial security," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "Your mother's nursing home bills, your daughter's college debt. He knows about these things, Margaret, and he's offering to help. All he asks is that you be there, at the end, so he doesn't die alone, surrounded by people who only wanted his money." Margaret sat very still. She thought of her mother, whose mind had slipped away to Alzheimer's 3 years ago. She thought of her daughter Sarah, working 2 jobs while trying to finish her teaching degree. She thought of her own credit cards, maxed out from trying to keep everyone afloat. But mostly, she thought of the loneliness in Dr. Harrison's description. A man dying with no one who truly cared. "I'd like to meet him," she said softly. Thomas Whitmore's room was on the top floor, in a private wing. When Margaret entered, she found him propped up in bed reading. He looked younger than she'd expected, perhaps late 50s, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples. His face was pale, but his brown eyes were clear and kind. "Mrs. Foster," he said, setting down his book. His voice was warm despite its weakness. "Thank you for coming." "It's Miss Foster," she corrected gently, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "I was married once long ago, but I went back to my maiden name." "Miss Foster," he repeated, a small smile crossing his face. "I imagine Dr. Harrison told you about my proposition. It must sound absurd." "It sounds lonely," Margaret said honestly. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes shift. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is that." They talked for hours that day, about simple things. He told her about his childhood in Nebraska, about learning to build birdhouses with his grandfather. She told him about her daughter, about the garden she tended in her tiny backyard, about the books she loved to read. When she left that evening, they had an understanding. Not a business arrangement, something gentler than that. A companionship, a promise to not let each other face the hard times alone. They were married on a Thursday afternoon in the hospital chapel. Sarah was there, confused but supportive, holding her mother's hand. Dr. Harrison served as a witness. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes. Afterward, Margaret returned to Thomas's room, now wearing a simple gold band on her finger. "I never thought I'd marry again," she admitted, settling into her usual chair. "Neither did I," Thomas replied. "I always thought I had time." "That's the thing about time. You think you have more of it than you do. The days took on a rhythm. Margaret would work her morning shift, then spend her afternoons with Thomas. They played chess, though he usually won. They watched old movies. He loved John Wayne westerns, and she introduced him to the gentle humor of The Andy Griffith Show. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, her knitting while he read. You know what I regret most? Thomas asked one evening, about 2 weeks after their wedding. The sun was setting, painting his room in shades of amber and gold. What's that? I spent so much time building things. Buildings, businesses, wealth. But I forgot to build relationships, real ones. Until now, I'm not sure I understood what I was missing. Margaret reached over and took his hand. His fingers were cool, his grip weak, but the gesture meant everything. We all get lost sometimes, she said softly. What matters is finding our way back. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Thomas was still here, still breathing. The doctors were cautiously optimistic but confused. His heart, which had been failing rapidly, seemed to have stabilized. It's remarkable, Dr. Harrison told them during a checkup. I can't explain it medically. Your condition hasn't reversed, Thomas, but it's not progressing either. You're holding steady. After he left, Thomas looked at Margaret with wonder in his eyes. Maybe I had something to live for, he said simply. As weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. Thomas began to improve. Slowly at first, he could sit up longer without tiring. Then he could walk to the window. Eventually, he could walk the entire corridor, Margaret at his side, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. The heart is a mysterious thing, Dr. Harrison marveled during one examination. Sometimes the will to live is the best medicine we have. Margaret watched this man she'd married out of kindness. This stranger who had become her friend grow stronger each day, and somewhere along the way, her feelings shifted too. She found herself thinking of him when they were apart. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She felt her own heart lift when she entered his room each day. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset together, Thomas turned to her. Margaret, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. I know how this started. I know it was meant to be temporary, a kindness you extended to a dying man. But somewhere along the way, he paused, searching for words. Somewhere along the way, I stopped wanting to just not die alone. I started wanting to truly live, with you. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. I know, she whispered. I feel it too. He reached for her hand, his grip firm and warm now. Would you consider staying married to me? Not because of money or obligation, but because I've fallen in love with you. Completely, unexpectedly, wonderfully. Margaret smiled through her tears. Thomas Whitmore, I thought you'd never ask. 6 months after their unusual wedding, Thomas was discharged from the hospital. They moved into a modest home, not one of his grand properties, but a comfortable house with a garden where Margaret could plant flowers and vegetables. Sarah visited often, delighted to see her mother so happy. Thomas sold most of his business holdings. He set up a foundation to help families struggling with medical debt. And every morning he and Margaret had coffee together on their back porch, watching the birds come to the feeders he'd built. You know what I've learned? Thomas said one morning, his arm around Margaret's shoulders as they rocked gently in their porch swing. What's that? That the best things in life come when you stop chasing them. When you open your heart to kindness, to connection, to love. Margaret leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Stronger now, resilient. Amen to that, she said softly. And as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, warming their faces and filling their garden with light, Margaret thought about how strange and beautiful life could be. How an act of kindness could transform 2 lonely people into something more. How love, real love, could bloom in the most unexpected places. They had been given a gift, not just more time, but a second chance. And they intended to cherish every single moment of it. Because in the end, that's what life is really about. Not the buildings we construct or the wealth we accumulate, but the hands we hold, the kindness we extend, the love we allow ourselves to both give and receive. And Margaret Foster Whitmore, at 52 years old, had finally learned that lesson, just in time.